Usually the first thing someone says when they're talking well beyond their authority is stressing how they've been with it for a very long time. For instance, people who started Gundam with Wing will say that they've been fans of Gundam for a very long time before diving into why something more in line with the original Gundam series, as well as the Universal Century timeline in general, is not a real Gundam, in favor of that two-dimensional side series they saw as a kid once. In a similar fashion, people who got into gaming later in life like to stress they've been playing video games all their life, to create a sense of community with their audience, because honestly speaking, we all have been playing games for most of our lives. For most people out there, gaming has always been there, even if we all started at different generations of it. These were my first thoughts watching Dishonored Wolf's video full of complaints about why the gaming industry is going to crash. He started off the video talking about how he played Pac-Man on a controller with 2 buttons on it. These types of videos and articles are very common, and the reason is fairly understandable too. I don't want to single this dude out because he's an idiot, because he actually is, but his video has so many interesting points to touch on that I still want to make a video anyway. He says a lot of things without making any real points, just loose, disconnected thoughts, more so than any article on this subject usually does. The gaming industry isn't dying. Not anytime soon anyway. Yeah, there are a lot of short-sighted trends constantly overlapping in it, but it was the same 20 years ago. Those trends might have stopped, but games changed and kept coming out anyway. This is the nature of a medium based around novelty, which video games most definitely are. For the record, I'd like to point out that video games aren't exclusive in this either. Movie-making trends and the format of episodic television content have all changed completely over the course of the last 20 years or so. Things work for a while, and then it's time to move on. Studios that can't move on fade away. Companies that do move with the times stay around. Note that this doesn't touch on the quality of the company staying or going, and it doesn't mean that the trends that the companies are following to stay alive are the trends that people want to see. Whenever people bring up the video game crash of the 80s and expect it to happen again, they tend to overlook an important aspect of it. The crash was not a global phenomenon, and it wasn't the entire industry. It's usually waved around as a full industry catastrophe that killed all of gaming, but that's not what happened. American companies killed the American console market. Europe's PC-based scene was still around doing their own thing, and Japan's arcade scene was becoming bigger than it had ever been. It got to a point that it couldn't really contain itself to arcades anymore, and it sprawled back into new console culture that would end up reviving Americas through the first Nintendo Entertainment System. Even its main rival at the time, Sega, was an arcade developer first and foremost. People often forget how arcades weren't just a novelty either. They were driving the industry forward at the time. They didn't just drain quarters from pockets, they were an incredibly competitive market with technological leaps forward at a rapid pace, offering hardware experiences you couldn't get at home. Japan still has an arcade culture, but with technology and access to games being where it is now, something like that isn't going to be possible anymore. Not counting the Japanese fighting game scene, it's mostly a novelty scene at this point. Specialized gimmicky setups. This is fine, but it won't translate over the same when games come over from arcade to console anymore. Japanese console games have suffered noticeably since the change from arcade hardware to what it is now. There's still a lot of problems with the idea that a video game industry crash would work out like it did last time, reviving the scene again at a higher quality. For one, what saved the gaming industry last time is that, globally speaking, there was no crash. Consoles in one continent crashed, and it's easier for a regional crash to recover if other regions are left alive to repopulate it with their goods. Currently, the gaming industry is working on a much more global scale than previously. Western and Japanese companies are often in ownership of one another, or at the very least have a back and forth between technologies used between the two. The 3 major console platform owners are American, Americanized Japanese, and Japanese. To fully crash the console market, you need a global crash. And if the industry crashes globally, who is left to revive it? It seems really weird to start spewing games as a medium are dying when we came out of the hottest Q1 that gaming has seen in a very long time. Not only was the quality and genre diversity of games absurd during the first few months of this year, almost every single game sold well, barring maybe Mass Effect Andromeda and Gravity Rush 2. Mass Effect Andromeda was well deserved with the state it was released in, together with the treatment of both the studio working on it and the series itself. And it's not just the games either. Sony has warned their investors that they likely won't be able to keep up the current sales pace because they pretty much have the entire market cornered. This is fairly absurd enough, but it also explains how such a wide collection of game releases could keep up decent sales numbers without cannibalizing each other. And the Nintendo Switch is selling at a record pace. You could count it off as a gimmick system or a Zelda machine, but hey, Zelda sells. Can't really talk long term just yet, but the speed it's selling at is beating the Wii's pace, and it's likely already the number 2 system on the market within a couple of months. It's actually absurd how fast this thing is selling. This isn't saying there are no bubbles, but the industry itself isn't one. Business models within the industry are definitely bubbles. You can only tie people to a game through emotional manipulation with unlocks that lose worth the moment they stop playing for so long until they get fatigued and don't want to deal with this anymore. Not only that, but you could tie people to a game too strongly, making it harder to let go and move on to the next. The true strength of League of Legends styles unlocks isn't that it takes a long time for players to get a decent toolkit where they can judge the game, it's that they're invested in staying because their progress and unlocks will mean less if they stop playing. In a similar sense, Overwatch's loot crates and its focus on loss aversion can only sucker people into purchases for so long until they're upset by the amount of times they didn't get the things that they wanted and refuse to bother at all anymore. Some of the old guard is more likely to stick around so as not to lose anything, but the idea for new players that they're lagging behind on the cool stuff to show off and that they'll never be able to get it is something that scares them away in the long run. It's not a long-term format, and the most obvious solution to stretch this out is something Blizzard is currently working on, moving similar loot box structures to other games to rotate people between them before they get burned out. This just delays the problem though, and it increases the severity of how hard people end up being burned out by this system. Will this kill gaming? No. Probably not. It might not even burn Overwatch all that much. Its lifecycle is already good for an online-only game. A new model and system will pop up to take its place, causing another loop that works until people get tired of it or burn out on it. It took several years for Team Fortress 2's hold to wear off for the majority of the audience. Dota 2 and CSGO cycled players through similar formats under the same umbrella for a while before Overwatch took its place. The audience aren't entirely the same. This went long enough for a different generation to go through the same kind of shit yet again. It's mostly the people who were there for Team Fortress 2's slide from a multiplayer game to a free-to-play multiplayer game to this misshapen thing covered in the graffiti of times past who take issue what is happening with Overwatch. In a very similar sense, DLC and microtransactions to siphon more sales numbers out of the same amount of total copies aren't as new as they often are represented. Neither are games getting patched. In the old days, games did not get patches, sure, but if a game was finished, it got printed on a cartridge or disc and get shipped out. Whatever you bought, that was the game. Though often enough, buying a later print of the same game could be an entirely different version, having a few changes in terms of bug fixes. Sometimes content changed heavily in later editions of the title. Two big examples are the international version of Final Fantasy VIII, which included a whole bunch of super bosses that weren't in the original, or more minor, like the Japanese release of Zelda 3 and the Western release of A Link to the Past. In a similar fashion, PC games sometimes got to the stores with a floppy disk patching the game, or in some rare cases had an update patch next to the original install executable for later releases. The usual analog for microtransactions tend to be arcades, but I don't think this is fair. Maybe the people arguing this don't remember the disparity between quality of arcade games and home systems. The main draw was an experience at a quality not available at home. They had to create overly ambitious arcade hardware with oversized motherboards and chip panels to do effects that even a full console generation later would struggle with. The difference between this and getting a new skin or a stronger character in a multiplayer game are very different. Before the availability of DLC and microtransactions, companies found other ways to get more sales out of their franchises. The older generations were the age of third-party controllers and peripherals, strategy guides, and help hotlines. The amount of plastic garbage made specifically for one or two games, or alternative dumb controllers people love to make fun of to this day, is absolutely insane. It's easy to overlook this now because we're no longer directly confronted with this flood of plastic diarrhea, and we might still get a lot of pro-gamer intense action, faster response times, gamer gear these days, but it's nowhere near as bad as it used to be. Arguments against hype trains as if they're a recent thing are equally hilarious. I remember seeing developer diaries of an upcoming sure-to-be 10 out of 10 masterpiece game detailing how fantastically deep it was going to be. Not only that, but really go back and look at all the Mortal Kombat games back in the day. Hype was all that kept that series going in spite of its gameplay. It had a cool song that people liked, and it had blood and gore. It even got politicians to talk about the direction that video games were going, and all the press talks that were surrounding that whole debate. Kids were pretending to be the characters on school grounds during lunch break, but The games themselves were kind of shitty, and it got to a point that a local game magazine got tired of the hate mail coming in from people actually reviewing it, that they ended up deciding to just give every new port and entry a 10 out of 10, a 2-page spread, and then write some bullshit text that had nothing to do with the game to fill out those 2 pages. If you don't believe video games were running on empty hype before the current generation, look at how much plastic garbage and marketing materials a lot of the retro gamers are hoarding to hold on to those good old hype days. Remember blast processing? Remember playing with power? Hype was always there, and a lot of it was empty. Situations like No Man's Sky have happened before and will happen again. People still cling to Fable as if that series didn't just fail to deliver on its initial promises, but then promised more and delivered even less each new title. People too lazy to look into what they're spending money on beyond annual press events will always get suckered into bad purchases. And to bring it back to that guy's channel, the Dishonored Wolf, he is pretending that Mass Effect Andromeda had a hype train going for it, and it wasn't just people pointing and laughing at how bad everything about it was. Is everyone collectively pointing and laughing at something a hype train? It sure as hell didn't convert into sales. People got their fill and moved on, as they should. It's a true shame what became of Mass Effect and BioWare, but the writing was on the wall years ago, not long after EA bought the company. He also seems to think that there's a separation between a game franchise with multiple entries being highly successful and the demand for new games. These games wouldn't keep selling without demand. Demand is the reason these constant sequels keep being made and keep getting sold, otherwise they would have bombed immediately at the second game. But because this fucknugget doesn't like a series, it means that there is no demand for each new entry, even though they're selling extreme amounts and people want more of them. I'm not a fan of annualized games for myself, but I'm not crazy enough to insist that this format came into being because nobody wanted more games. If there's a real disappointment, it's that this guy's opinions are being validated by the amount of subscribers and views that he's getting over his shitty video. Even if the majority of the comments are tearing his unfinished thoughts presented as arguments a new one, at least the audience out there looking for content talking about video games is too smart to fall for this kind of dumb bullshit. Though it is sad that with the way that YouTube promotes things, this is what they'll come across instead of channels that actually do give a shit. People out there are capable of making their own judgments, and I hope that a bunch of the people that are logical enough to be able to tear this guy apart in his comment section end up making their own analysis channel, or their own channel just talking about video games in general, because they'll more than likely do a good job at it, and hopefully they can grow on their own so we can have a better dialogue about how the industry is moving. Because to still believe that the industry is going to crash when you're well beyond your first video or your first article, that is absurd. Anyway, this was AboveUp. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see ya.